There we are. Right, thank you. So there we are, Haverfordwest Priory. It's a small Augustinian monastery lying outside the south side of the town in a suburb known as Haverford on the banks of the River Cleddau. And the monastery was the last state acquisition of a medieval monastery in Wales. It came into care in 1982, which is really only relevant if you remember that the excavation of the main medieval monasteries acquired by the state previous to as late as around 1960 were carried out by work staff under the rather distant supervision of the London-based inspectorate. So when you look at the distribution, oh dear, my slides aren't moving on.
Arrows on your keyboard.
There we are. Good, thank you. So if you look at the distribution of the medieval monasteries in Wales, and the 13 state guardianship monuments are encircled on the map, you can see that any of the monastic layouts known to us were usually exposed by non-archaeological clearance to medieval floor level. So our understanding of dissolution and post-monastic levels on most of these sites is extremely limited. Haverfordwest therefore did give us the opportunity to explore these horizons more thoroughly, added to which, unusually, the entire site at Haverfordwest was available for excavation because the site and the surrounding area had escaped post-dissolution redevelopment. Oh dear, so sorry. The distribution of Augustinian houses in Wales shows that in comparison with their popularity in England, and you just have to look at the dots here, don't have to worry about anything else, the numbers are significantly fewer. I'd only draw your attention to one over Llantoni in the southeast, where the layout is fairly well preserved. And Terry James's Carmarthen excavations, another Augustinian house, which is one of the few excavations, modern excavations, where the layout of the priory was fairly well explored. Haverfordwest itself was a neglected ruin in 1980 when I first saw it, with little visible masonry, rather other than the transepts and the west end of the nave, which were very much overgrown. We did know, however, that the masonry footings of the entire site did survive to some depth under that topsoil and vegetation, because Alfred Clapham and one young Mortimer Wheeler had done some exploratory trenches in the 1920s. My own excavations started in 1983 and went on till 2000, commenced after the initial vegetation strip. You can see that in the bottom right-hand image of the masonry and the recording and its gradual conservation. The overburden varied from over a metre, as you can see here in the cloister in the bottom left-hand corner, to a few centimetres, barely covering the east end of the presbytery near the river, where the floodwater had repeatedly removed topsoil and vegetation. Though the cartulary is lost, a confirmatory charter of Edward III from 1331 states that the priory was founded by Robert Fitzrichard of the Anglo-Norman Flemish Tancred family. And we think that this memorial effigy, found in bits in the chapter house around a plinth in the floor, which you can see in the bottom, in the middle, might just be him, although actually he died in exile in 1211. But he was removed from the lordship for some reason in 1210. So it's assumed that the monastic community was given the land a little bit before that. However, nothing we saw on the site found dates to before the 1220s. So it's just possible that the canons had a temporary home elsewhere, possibly in the chapel in the castle. There's no evidence for this at all. I just really made it up before the main site was made ready, and that really did take some doing, as we'll see. The site that the Augustinians had been so generously given by the Tancred family was a sloping greenfield site down which streams cascaded onto the marshy land by the tidal river, subject to frequent floods. So the first site preparation involved the cutting of tons and tons of material from the slope on the west, which was carted laboriously to build up the marsh by some 2.5 meters, as we found when we were excavating a series of sondages outside the presbytery and by the river. And the line between the cut and the fill was a clean subsoil on the west and the browner there and along there. So the cleaner subsoil here and the browner dumped material to the east could be clearly seen in the cloister, along with the drains initially dug to divert the stream water to the river. The walls of the church were built over wide battered foundations, which you can see in the bottom right-hand screen, dug slightly into the marsh surface, and the masonry was put down in flat horizons, and that was used by the carts for passage, dumping the material to either side, build up the earth around the foundations as they were built. Gradually, the cruciform church and the claustral ranges were raised, and this conventional footprint with the church on the north of a small square cloister, rectilinear chapter house, and the slype. On this plan actually it's called the sacristy because in subsequent years it was blocked off to become a sacristy, but a slype first of all, with the dormitory above on the east, the refectory, complete with a lavatorium screen for the canons to wash their hands just by the doorway there on the south, and the western cellarers range. And this plan remained largely for 300 years of the Priory's life. The excavations established the tiled floors of the step presbytery with its altar against the east wall, which you can see the altar base in the bottom of the bottom left-hand corner of the image. The transepts, the top right-hand is the northern transept, much mucked about by post-dissolution rubbish pits, and the nave in the bottom right-hand corner. Excavations established that the original church had no tower, and that from the start the main church entrance was on the north, and you might be able to see it where the masonry finishes here, and here is the main church door on the north side. And the reason for that, of course, was that the site was always very squashed from east to west. It was confined on the west by the slope and the necessity to put a road from the town and the monastic gateway on the north to the southern service areas of the Priory on this west side. And it was very much constrained by the river to the east. And there was precious little space on the east outside the presbytery wall to build the precinct wall, which was absolutely essential to keep all the floodwater out. And this always rather wet site, the drains around the cloister, massive drains built around the cloister, and the large drain through the slype, which drained from the cloister down to the river, continued to do essential and sterling work. And the roofs of all these early buildings were pembrokeshire slate, topped with ceramic ridge tiles. The canons had responsibility for maintaining services at the 3 churches in the town, and the fact that it had 3 parishes gives us an indication of the importance of Haverfordwest as a market and trading town in the medieval period. The Priory was given, both in the original charter and subsequently, a fair amount of land within the town, reaching right down to Merlin's Bridge, or that's a corruption, of course, of Magdalene's, which is a reference to the leper hospital here, and that's beyond the plan actually to the south. And it was given a grange called Cokie in the town and a manor called Green to the south to assist with the provision of food and income. And gradually a number of more distant churches were acquired, including the chapel at Christiswell, or Cresswell now as it's known, and many references tell of the canons who were made deacons and priests throughout the years to take responsibility for services held in the appropriated churches. So fast forward, as I must, some 200 years to the main period of refurbishment and alterations in the mid-15th century, enabled by donations and benefactors, a few of whose names we know. Though the footprint of the Priory remained unaltered, the church and claustral buildings saw large-scale embellishment. Firstly, and probably most strikingly, a tower was added to the church. Unusually, and if anybody knows of any parallels, I'd be very grateful if they could let me know. It's added to the east end of the nave, within the nave on the east end, with a high status burial laid within it on a plinth. And here you can see the collapse of the north and the south tower arches, the south tower arch here, the north here, and bits indeed of the east and west walls, which have fallen bodily into the nave, which is a catastrophic post-dissolution collapse, which twisted the north nave completely out of true, as you can see here. The transepts were raised at the same time, necessitating a substantial re-roofing exercise, and the choir stalls altered, and a new pulpitum screen built, and 2 nave altars raised on tiled steps. And at this point, a new aisle or chapel was added on the north of the nave, accessed from the north transept. And the floors and the presbytery steps were raised and retiled, and the nave newly floored with slate over the old tiled floor. Probably as part of the same large-scale programme of work, the cloister with the old cloister, the original cloister, with its charming purple Cadw stone abbey key, you can see here, beautiful work, was replaced with one fashioned of cream-coloured bath stone, and the bath stone edge, there's not much of it left, but the bath stone edge you can see alongside the drain edge here. Its garden had a central octagonal feature, perhaps a water stoop, surrounded by a hedge and a cruciform path, which reused as paving slabs the earlier Cadw abbey key, which was great as far as we're concerned because they survived for us to find them. The old floors of green and buff tiles were raised and relaid, and although they look red and black, actually these are green and buff, which you can see in the less worn areas on the sides. The chapter house also was substantially altered, and benches were added around the walls, and it was refloored with the green and white tiles that survive here today. And just while we're looking at this slide, just keep your eye on these bits of bath stone laid out on the floor, which I'll talk about later on. And more dramatically, its roof was refashioned with a new bath stone vault, pretty huge thing, difficult to get off the site, as you can see, supported on elaborate corbels, one of which survived on the floor for us to find, this remarkable 7-headed corbel, which was holding up the vault. An unexpected but exciting discovery was that of the medieval garden, raised over the old canon's cemetery. It was not actually part of our original strategy for excavation, but we started finding these wonderful little stone walls and we wondered what they were. So we decided to extend the excavation to explore them. And the garden does remain one of the most attractive features of the site today. It's sort of symmetrical. Its beds are arranged in pairs, but of different sizes to complement the adjacent buildings. The most elaborate had a square internal bed with a surrounding path and a turf bench on the side with a central doorway, which post-hole suggests was covered with a trellis arch, such as you find on the several illustrations in medieval illustrated books of ours you might be familiar with. So the reef did have some pretensions to comfortable and impressive living. It may have derived some income from pilgrims to St David's, though there's no documentary proof of this. But its main income was from spiritualities, and its benefactors, among whom the Perrott family was preeminent, wills of the Perrott family, and a very specific one, which is just great actually, of 1456, of David Cherbury, who was a bishop of Dromore. And he gave money to ensure that a quarter of the cloister was funded, so we know exactly when this cloister was refurbished after 1456. And the Perrots and David Cherbury gave money to ensure that they were actually buried inside the church. It was never the strategy to excavate and remove burials, but in some cases where graves had been substantially disturbed or they were buried in such shallow graves that the excavation and access arrangements endangered their survival, a few skeletons were removed for study and reburial on site. A series of, we assumed, high-status individuals were buried within the presbytery and elsewhere in the church, in fact. Townsfolk were buried in cemetery around the north side of the church, and the canons, before the garden was established, were buried in the canons' cemetery at that point. And we don't know where the canons were buried after the garden was put there. We'd rather hoped that the isotope analysis, which we undertook on the few skeletons which we did take up, would give us some information about the different lifestyles of these different classes of burials. And despite the small number of individuals analysed, there did seem to be some distinction. 2 of the 3 individuals we tested who were buried near the altar, who you would expect to be high status people, showed a diet richer in marine protein, suggesting a higher status than the larger terrestrial derived diet of the townsfolk. But all individuals appeared to have been born and bred in southwest Wales, except one of the townsfolk who appeared to have been brought up in a geologically different area, such as the East Midlands, only moving to Haverfordwest as an adult. But of course, the end came at the dissolution. The excavation did allow us to understand quite well the very systematic process of dismantling the priory, but one example of this must suffice. We know that the roof was of Preseli slate, and very little lead was actually found on site. But what there was, of course, perhaps from water pipes and window cames, was melted down on site, formed onto ingots, and transported to the treasury of Henry VIII. And we were lucky enough to find one of these buried here in the southern choir stall, buried by sons of masonry, which obviously fallen in rather a haphazard way from the south transept arch. And it was abandoned by Cromwell's men, who clearly couldn't be bothered to dig it all out. But not before it had been stamped with the rose and crown and numbered. And it was quite interesting to know what happened when the numbers of the stamped ingots, which presumably were registered on site, didn't match the numbers that arrived at the treasury. But not only did we find the ingot, but we also found the mould, or half of it anyway, disturbed by a later post-dissolution rubbish pit, unfortunately. It was tile-lined and encrusted with lead, and this had actually formed the ingot. It was put in the crossing. Clearly, that the crossing of the church was earmarked as a place for lead reprocessing. Over the tile floor were remnants of bath stone moulding, and perhaps you'll remember the bits that you saw in the chapter house in the earlier image. And basically what they were doing was cutting off the old-fashioned decorative bits, chopping them off the slabs of stone so that the valuable slabs could be transported elsewhere for building material. Similarly, stone slabs from the nave and the garden paths had been removed. Not so the ceramic tiles, which were clearly regarded as so broken and difficult to extract that they weren't really worth bothering about. And so to the demise of the priory, which was sold to the Barlows and thereafter the Perrots, and tradition has it, further masonry removed to rebuild the Perrot mansion at Harrelston, a mile down the road. The ruins were left so that by the later 16th century, surveys tell us that only apparently a ruinous dovecote remained. This isn't quite true, as the drawings like this of the mid-18th century of the Buck brothers on the top left, and the early 19th century drawing by Richard Colt Hall, through these we can see the gradual collapse of the presbytery and claustral building walls, and the use of the ruins for smithies. And you can see some of this rather haphazard looking shipbuilding taking place on the river bank. The laying out of the site to make it, we hope, informative to the visitor, but safe from the depredations of myriad feet, led us to build up the robbed masonry of the presbytery and the garden walls. So these are slightly built up walls. And we put them over a line of red tile, which distinguished the additional masonry from the original. And we reburied the tiled floors to protect them in the church, the chapter house and the cloister under a terram and sand layer with a lime concrete surface with scoured diagonal lines suggesting the orientation of the tile layout, with small slate markers showing the position of the later graves. Sadly, no pollen or macroflora survived in the garden, the soils within the beds having been washed away through centuries of flooding, so we took the liberty of adding topsoil and planting the beds with plants known to have been used in such gardens in the 15th and 16th centuries. So the excavation report makes progress, and just to show you the roof furniture that I'm obsessing about at the moment, you can get awfully anarchy about all this. Here are the decorative ridge tiles that I've been looking at. The top left-hand corner, you can see the greeny yellow overlapping tiles, all found within falling distance of the tower, suggesting that the tower had a saddleback or a pyramidal roof. And the top right shows you the dark green composite tiles, which had fallen apart at that weak point, the junction where the separately made upper decorative crest, which is actually this, had fallen off the main body of the tiles, which were made separately. And these two have been stuck together using keying formed by the tiler's fingers. And I've never really quite grown up, actually. I find it really quite exciting still to be able to put my fingers and fingernails sometimes into the holes made by the tiler's fingers all those years ago. And below are some of the different sizes of the Preseli roof slates with water lines on them. You can see, suggesting that the tradition of Pembrokeshire slurrying of roofs was employed to repair the poor local slates as early as the 15th century. So I'll leave it there. There's plenty more of the site to excavate: the refectory, the West Range, kitchens, the infirmary and the Prior's house all await discovery and excavation. But we know that they're there, waiting patiently for the next phase in the life of this small Augustinian priory, where the canons praised God administered to the people of Haverfordwest. Thank you very much.